when we make rules, when it comes to the way we conduct war, we should stick to those rules. We should stick to them. Not to mention, it probably doesn't help that the Biden administration's U.S. ambassador to the UN called the Russian use of cluster munitions in Ukraine a war crime. It also didn't help that Jens Stoltenberg, the head of NATO, General Secretary of NATO, said the same thing. Okay, we got to talk about the cluster munitions, don't we? I wanted to avoid it because this is a difficult topic, especially since I filmed with, and not only filmed, but really lived with a demining crew here in Ukraine for about a year, and decision's already been made. So these are the crews that are going to have to deal with this once this is all said and done. We already know, man, like 80 to 100 years of demining work. That's, of course, removing any gigantic innovations in the field. I think the use of drones by a lot of demining crews is going to be a gigantic help. Everywhere I see demining crews, I see the use of drones, and they're figuring out new ways to try to confront demining. But no matter what, there's going to be decades and decades of demining work. So this is a difficult topic, but let's get into it. So the United States federal government has just approved another $800 million AIDS package using Joe Biden's presidential drawdown authority. This, I think, gets it up to like 42 billion or some amount of number between 40 billion and 50 billion. Because of how the Pentagon has had a few errors here and there and how they're accounting for it and how they count replacements. I don't remember the exact number, but I know it's between somewhere in the 40 to 50 billion mark. That isn't the amount of weapons that have gotten to Ukraine. That's just the amount of weapons that have been approved, because about, I don't know, at least 40% of that, 40% of that still hasn't arrived in Ukraine. A lot of the equipment hasn't arrived yet in Ukraine. I think the Abrams tanks still have yet to arrive in Ukraine. But anyway, they have approved another AIDS package, and this AIDS package includes 31 new howitzers, artillery guns. It includes new Bradley vehicles, Stryker vehicles. It includes munitions for the HIMARS, which have been used to great effect in Ukraine. They're using they're sending over new Patriot missiles to be used with the Patriot missile systems, the 2 batteries that we sent over that have been used to great effect, more anti-air weapons, and decidedly cluster munitions. Now, I'm going to be very technical here because I think we should be specific, right? Where we shouldn't be stupid. So they're sending dual purpose conventional improved munitions, but they're cluster munitions. And the main one that's being sent is the M864 artillery shell. Now, this was first produced in 1987, and it's fired from a 155 millimeter howitzer. Now, the M777 artillery gun that we sent over there that has a tremendous range, a much larger range than what most of the Russian artillery guns have, and is extremely precise, has been used to great effect. That fires 155 millimeter shells, right? So this is a cluster munition that can be put into the artillery gun. It is then fired, and how it works is once it's over the position it's been fired at, the cluster munition explodes in the air, and it drops a ton of bomblets. That's what they call them. Bomblets, they're basically just smaller bombs. Bomblets. Cute, even if they're unbelievably deadly dangerous and have a high dud ratio, which we're going to talk about in a moment. Then after they explode in the air and these bomblets fall, they hit the entire area, and instead of one big artillery shell hitting one spot, it spreads over an area that can be extremely large, sometimes the size of entire football fields, multiple football fields, and a very large ratio. I believe the amount of bomblets that are with the 864 artillery shell is 72. So we're talking 72 bomblets, but I don't know if that's going to be the only cluster munition we sent over, because once we open the door on sending cluster munitions to Ukraine, this does potentially open the door for future cluster munitions that could only get more and more dangerous. Now, the Biden administration has said that they are carefully choosing which cluster munitions are being sent over and making sure that they meet a 2.5% dud ratio. And what a dud is, well, I think most people know what a dud is, but a dud is an explosive that doesn't explode. And so it's dangerous. It can go off at a much later date. There's a possibility of it causing problems for civilians or demining crews long after the fact. And not only civilians and demining crews, which is the main thing people are focusing on, but it could also kill, possible soldiers if they don't know what they're doing. Let's say a position is hit by a big cluster munition, right? And it has, you know, 1 or 2 unexploded bomblets, and a soldier goes to take the position that was just wiped out, a Russian trench position, presumably in Zaporozhye, for example, and then they touch a cluster munition and they can get killed. And so with these types of weapons, there's going to have to come a tremendous amount of training for soldiers who are going to be involved in storming these trenches, because these are going to be used to great effect in Zaporozhye. And let me just say, as much as human rights groups are not happy right now with cluster munitions being sent to Ukraine by the United States, as much as a lot of politicians are angry about it, and I'm going to talk about my thoughts in a moment, the people who are most angry about it are the Russians. These types of cluster munitions, and I'm not the only person saying this, a lot of defense officials have said this, a lot of other weapons experts and munitions experts have said this, these types of cluster munitions are going to be used to great effect, gigantic effect, in an area like Zaporozhye, where there's a lot of dug-in, entrenched, fortified positions filled to the brim with artillery guns, heavy machine guns, and a whole host of other equipment, mortars. These type of cluster munitions can wipe out trench lines. This type of cluster munition can wipe out a ton of equipment. And a lot of them don't just, drop anti-personnel explosives, but explosives that can penetrate and destroy vehicles. These were used to great effect by the United States in the Gulf War, for example. I don't know if you guys have ever heard of the Highway of Death, but it's called the Highway of Death for a reason. Extremely deadly, to great effect. Let me just give you guys an example of what a cluster munition can do. Here is a cluster munition in action. I don't believe this is the exact type of munition, like the one with 72 bomblets that we talked about earlier, the 864, but it's the same principle all in effect. So here's an example of what it can do. So imagine how you think of a normal shell, how it hits one spot, there's an explosion, right? It hits like one point within the trench. It sucks for the trench line, but the rest of the trench is still intact. It still can be filled with personnel. If somebody misses that one explosion, oh, okay, they're okay, they haven't been killed. Well, this is how a cluster munition works. Just boom, just like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. And we're talking 72 bomblets. This can wipe out trench lines. This can wipe out entire convoys. This can wipe out retreating soldiers. This can wipe out advancing soldiers. This is going to be used to great effect in any entrenched, well-fortified positions that the Russians have built up in Zaporozhye. And that's part of the reason why the Ukrainians have asked for it. And that's a big thing I need to emphasize here. The Ukrainians asked for it. We're not the ones pushing this on the Ukrainians, as if we're like, you have to take cluster munitions. The Ukrainians have been asking for cluster munitions for months. The Russians have been using cluster munitions to great effect, on a very large scale, for quite some time now, since the start of the war. The Ukrainians have also been, I believe, credibly accused of using cluster munitions, even if it's on a smaller scale. Cluster munitions have already been sent to the Ukrainians. They are desperately in need of new shells. They are in the middle of a shell shortage. And these types of munitions, not only just due to the size of the explosions and the amount of bomblets there are, not only can it make up for just the shell deficit on a basic level, but it also has more power to the punch. And so it tries to help the Ukrainians match the amount of shell output that the Russians have, which they have on a much larger scale, as well as using these types of cluster munitions. And so that's why the Ukrainians want it. The American government has responded. I know Joe Biden has talked about as to why he wants it. The reasons he gave, let's see, I think I have the article here. He said it was a very difficult decision. We're going to get into specifics in a moment here about what the critics are saying and my opinion about it. He said it was a difficult decision, but that the fact of the matter is that American artillery shell production, the types of shells that they usually use, the conventional shells that we've been sending over for the M777 howitzer, the production plants that we have in areas like Philadelphia and New Jersey, even though they've ramped up production has not ramped up enough that they can match all the shells that the Ukrainians are losing. And so that they have to draw upon some other stockpile. And in the American stockpile, we have about 4.7 million types of shells, rockets, or other types of cluster munitions sitting in stockhouses and warehouses that could potentially be sent to Ukraine, which I think accumulative leads to about I believe the rate I heard is of like 500 million bomblets in that set of 4.7 million cluster munitions. So this opens up more weapons to be used by the Ukrainians, allows, and this is what the American government to say, allows the American government to have a stockpile that they can rely on for now as they make a transition to have higher artillery shell production that can then match the Ukrainians and what they're producing and what the Ukrainians are using. And so the Obama administration, the Biden administration has emphasized that this isn't a final, like forever, we're just always going to be sending cluster munitions to Ukraine. That they're only going to be sending cluster munitions to Ukraine up until they hit a ratio of shell production where they no longer have to do it and they can just send normal shells. But outside of that, there's also deeper strategic reasons as to why the Ukrainians want it and as to why it's being sent over, with defense officials saying that this is going to be extremely useful for the counteroffensive that is ongoing right now. So that's the Obama reasoning for it. Now, the dud ratio that the American government has given for this is about 2.5%, or I think 2.35% was the highest I think they said, but they said they won't send any cluster munition that has a higher dud ratio of 2.5%. These duds that are going to be a problem for deminers in the future and civilians could possibly interact with. Now, this is well over the limit that we actually have set as the federal limit for our government as to what type of weapons we can transfer in their dud ratio when it comes to cluster munitions. Federally, the law is 1%. If it has over a 1% ratio of duds in the shells that we're firing, the cluster munitions that we're firing, we can't send that to our allies. We cannot transfer that. Biden has waived that. He's waived that. I have the specifics here because it's a bunch of bureaucratic mumbo jumbo, but I'll read it to you. Where is it? There is no waiver provision in the 1% limit Congress has placed on cluster munition dud rates. By the way, fun fact, this isn't a fun fact, but it's an important fact. Donald Trump tried to get rid of the dud ratio rate in its entirety while he was in office. In its entirety. And so I just do want to say, because I have seen a lot of like pro-Trump elected officials, and I've seen definitely in the more like MAGA type Marjorie Taylor Greene crowd, and I've seen a lot of influencers who supported Trump like railing against the Biden administration for this. Donald Trump wanted to do this, but on steroids with no regulations, period. Not being sent over to Ukraine, but sending over to anyone. So potentially, like, for example, the Saudi Arabian government, which he had a very friendly relationship with and wanted to send a lot of weapons over to. I did want to put that there. But there is no waiver provision in the 1% limit Congress has placed on cluster munition dud rates, written into Defense Department appropriations for the last 7 years. Biden is bypassing it and Congress, according to the White House official, drawing down the munitions from existing defense stocks under a rarely used provision of the Foreign Assistance Act, which allows the president to provide aid regardless of appropriations or arm export restrictions, as long as he determines that it is in the vital U.S. national security interest. Now, personally, I don't know how I feel about this being law, period. I think the more I think about it, the more solidly against it I am. Because could you imagine somebody like Donald Trump in office makes the determination like, Yemen, the Houthis, backed by Iran, they give money to other groups that fight American soldiers, kill American soldiers in the Middle East. It is now a U.S. national security priority to send cluster munitions over to the Saudi government to use in Yemen, with zero idea about what the dud rate should be. He's not going to give any fuck about what the dud rate should be. So this is already provision that I don't really like that much, right? The fact that, 100% dud rate. Just give them only duds. Only duds. And not the fun candy type, but the bad type, the type that kills people. But that's the way Biden is getting it through. Biden has made the determination that this is what the Ukrainians want, this is what they're going to have. I think we should, to give his perspective, I think better, it would probably be best if I just read what Biden said. 1 second. I think I closed that article. Let's bring it up. Because I think he was interviewed by Fareed Zakaria about this as it's come to public knowledge. Biden says sending cluster munitions to Ukraine was a difficult decision, but that they needed them. President Joe Biden told CNN's Fareed Zakaria Friday that it was a difficult decision to provide Ukraine with cluster munitions for the first time. but he was ultimately convinced to send the controversial weapon because Kiev needs ammunition in its counteroffensive against Russia. The White House announced Friday that the president had approved the transfer of cluster munitions to Ukraine, the later instance where the U.S. provided Kiev with weapons it initially resisted sending into the war. It was a very difficult decision on my part, and by the way, I discussed this with our allies. I discussed this with our friends up on the Hill, Biden said, adding, the Ukrainians are running out of ammunition. This is a war relating to munitions, and they're running out of ammunition, and we're low on it. And so what I finally did is I took the recommendation of the Defense Department to, not permanently, but to allow for this transition period while we get 155 weapons, these shells for the Ukrainians, the 155 millimeter shells, that is, that are being produced in American weapons manufacturing plants across the country. There are more than 100 countries, including the United Kingdom and France and Germany, who have outlawed the munitions under the Convention on Cluster Munitions. But the US, Ukraine are not signatories to the ban. Neither is Russia, by the way. They're trying to get through these trenches and to stop these tanks from rolling. But it was not an easy decision, Biden said. We're not signatories to that agreement, but it took me a while to be convinced to do it. But the main thing is, they either have the weapons to stop the Russian now, keeping them from stopping the Ukrainian offensive in these areas, or they don't. And I think they need them. Okay, so that's Biden's reasoning. And I can tell you from talking to a lot of Ukrainians here on the ground that the majority of Ukrainians that I've talked to support this move or are okay with this move to some degree, or either they're like somewhat neutral on it or they're just blatantly in favor. I've found very few people who are outright against it. In fact, after, living with demining crews and filming with them for a month, I texted a few of them because I have a bunch of demining contacts, and I couldn't find a deminer that was against these weapons being sent. Now, that is my personal anecdotal experience, and I talked to like 3, right? I'm sure if I did like a study of like 2,000 deminers and the CESU workers in the Ukrainian service, maybe I would get a different perspective. That's just my personal anecdotal experience. And of course, this is dependent upon what information they have about the dud rates. And that's what I want to talk about here. It is the dud rates. So the government is saying 2.35% is the dud rate ratio, and they're not going to go over 2.5%. Now, this is peculiar, or was peculiar to me, because a study that the government did do, I think it was like 7 years ago. One second, I think I have it somewhere here. Here it is. In its last publicly available estimate, more than 20 years ago, the Pentagon assessed that the artillery shell to have a dud rate of 6%, meaning that at least 4 of each of the 27 submunitions each shell carries would remain unexploded across an area of approximately 22,500 square meters, roughly the size of 4.5 football fields. And so this surprised me. I was like, okay, government saying 2.5%, 2.35%. This report from 20 years ago on the munitions that they're sending says 6%, which is 6 times what the current federal requirement is for what we are allowed to say, what the current federal restrictions are. The government responded saying, we are aware of reports from several decades ago that indicate certain 155 DPICMs, if DPICM stands for dual purpose conventional improved munitions, but it's cluster munitions. The reason they call it dual purpose is because it could be used to clear out infantry. It could be used to destroy vehicles, destroying trench. It's dual purpose. It can be used in many different ways. We are aware of reports from several decades ago that indicate certain 155 DPICMs have higher dud rates, said a defense official. One of 7 Pentagon White House officials who spoke on the condition of anonymity to discuss the sensitive decision. The defense official used the acronym for dual. Okay, they're explaining what I just said. The Pentagon now says it has new assessments based on testing as recent as 2020, with failure rates no higher than 2.35%. While that exceeds the limit of 1% mandated by Congress every year since 2017, officials are carefully selecting munitions with the 2.35. Okay, so it's not 35. I was thinking it was 2.5, but it is the 2.35. 2.3. Sorry, I'm fumbling. 2.35% dud rate or below for transfer to Ukraine. Okay, so they're saying they're waiving the 1%, and the 6% report from back in the day, that's scary, but that's not real. Now it's 2.35%. We're being careful with what munitions we pick. Now, I want to believe the United States federal government when they say this, right? As we all know, the United States federal government is always trustworthy. They're great. Always trust the Fed man. But they also didn't make the testing data that made them come to these conditions and come to this percentage. They didn't share the testing data. They didn't share the conditions that it was tested in. And a lot of munitions experts that I've talked to are scared that these munitions were tested in ideal conditions. We're tested in conditions that are not going to be out there realistically in the field. And for transparency, definitely if the federal government is going to be waiving the 1% threshold that we've had, on top of the fact that I believe the use of cluster munitions in warfare, due to its imprecise nature and high dud ratio just generally, are immoral. But if they're going to do this, they need to make this information public and transparent, not only for the American public, so they're sure that they're not sending over weapons that are going to unduly, compared to what's going on right now, pollute the countryside, and that the government is telling the truth about this, but also for our Ukrainian allies who are making the decision to take these weapons into their hands and use them. And for the Ukrainian civilians who also have their perspective in mind, because they're the ones who are going to have to live with the countryside polluted by duds. They're the ones that are going to have to live with this, and the demining crews who are going to actually have to be the ones to go out and demine the muds and lose hands, lose legs, lose both of their legs, be permanently disfigured and disabled by these types of explosions. So I think this information should be public if they're going to be making these transfers, right? If they're going to be doing it, the least they can do is make the testing data more public and be more transparent with it. And I'm not the only person to bring up this point. A lot of munitions experts have brought up this point publicly, including multiple NGOs that are concerned about unexploded munitions. Now, I don't want to paint this picture as if beforehand there was this, we were using artillery shells that were perfectly moral and didn't have high dud rates, and now America has introduced the situation, munitions that are terribly immoral and nobody was using. And the truth of the matter is, the Russians have been using cluster munitions extensively for the entirety of this war. Extremely effective cluster munitions that railed urban centers, mind you. And we're not talking about the countryside and the fields, which the Ukrainian government has told the Biden administration, have said this publicly. If they're going to use these cluster munitions, they're not going to use them in urban environments. They're going to use them out in the fields of Zaporozhye, where the most entrenched Russian positions are right now, as they're trying to break through the counteroffensive. Now, who knows if the Ukrainians stated that commitment, but the Russians have used cluster munitions in urban environments. They've used them in non-urban environments. They've used them on civilian housing. They've used them in a ton of dangerous environments. And the cluster munitions they're using, old Soviet stockpiles from 50, 60 years ago with extremely high dud rates, much higher than 1%, much higher than 2.5%, much higher than 6%. And the normal artillery shells they're using, due to the age and, wear of tear of just, the times passing, they have high dud ratios as well. We're talking about 20 to 30 to higher than that percentage points. We don't have exact data because the Russians aren't going to make that type of data available. And they're certainly, if they did make that data available, who knows if we could trust it, and they probably wouldn't show us the conditions they tested this under. And so this isn't like all of a sudden Ukraine's going to be introduced to this catastrophe. And from reading the messages online, it feels like a lot of people think that Ukraine has now entered a catastrophe of unexploded munitions. That has already been a catastrophe that has existed in Ukraine for the last 80 years of unexploded munitions in the soil from World War I and World War II that killed civilians every year. And they were removing thousands upon thousands, tens of thousands of unexploded munitions up and before this war, like through the early to mid 2000s from World War I and World War II. They're still removing during the war munitions from World War I and World War II. Then 2014 happens. You have unexploded ordnance going off, being spread across mostly eastern Ukraine. You have mines being placed down, anti-tank mines, anti-personnel mines, butterfly mines. 2022 comes around. All of this intensifies to new heights. And now the estimates I was getting 4 or 5 months ago is that it's going to take roughly 70 to 100 years to demine the country. And that was 4 months ago. So now that data's like, that was if the war stopped 4 or 5 months ago. It's been 4 or 5 months since then, since I was given that estimate. So Now it's even higher than the 70% like base ratio. We're probably talking like 80%. I mean, and 80%, 80 years to 100 years. Now, again, this assumes a lack of innovation and like demining, and I'm sure that there are going to be innovations in demining, but it adds decades upon decades upon decades. At the very least, it's going to be decades upon decades and decades, and we know that. And so I am extremely reluctant to add to that problem, but that problem has been being added to it. I'm using improper grammar, but that problem has been getting worse and worse and worse every day of this war, period. From the Russian use of cluster munitions and from the use of old Soviet stockpiles that have a tremendously high dud rate, much higher than anything we're providing the Ukrainians. Anything that we're providing the Ukrainians, especially if the Biden administration is giving a shred of honesty when they say they're going to be careful with what cluster munitions we pick from our stockpiles, because let me tell you, there are stuff in our stockpiles that are going to have a much higher dud ratio than 2.35%, if that percentage that the government is giving, since they haven't given the testing data along with that, is accurate. Emergency Octopus, thank you for the primer being sub for 5 months. I appreciate that. And so this is already a gigantic issue already, right? And so a lot of people are just getting introduced to this issue right now because of America providing the cluster munitions. But that issue has existed for a while. And the Ukrainian mindset going into this, for my discussions with them, is this. You know, there won't be a village to return to be concerned about cluster munitions, or there won't be a countryside to return to be concerned about cluster munitions if we don't liberate it. We're seeing right now as the Russian government is deporting anyone who does not accept Russian citizenship. They're going to take away their property rights. They're going to harass them. They're doing everything they can to forcefully erase these people's national identity. They're taking away their homes, and they're giving it to who? Settlers from other parts of the country. And so as, you know, the days like go on and on and on with this war, the humanitarian situation for those in occupied territory is only going to get worse. And if that territory is never liberated, then that humanitarian situation, that horrific humanitarian situation, is going to become permanent. Permanent. With no like, oh, we can get to 20 to 30 to 40 years of work, we can remove it. There will be no forest for kids to be afraid to go into if they don't liberate and have the forest, period. And that's the mindset that I'm getting back from people. But man, on principle, I still stand against the use of cluster munitions in principle. And I am terrified of extending the period of this humanitarian catastrophe. When I think about kids and families being afraid to go into the forests behind them, finding butterfly mines just like 20, 25 feet from civilian homes could kill them, principally, I'm against cluster munitions, right? But we're sending the cluster munitions, and hopefully they're used to clear out the Russian occupiers. Hopefully they're used to great effect to clear out the Russian occupiers, since the decision's been made. And I understand Biden when he says it was a difficult decision to make. I don't know if I could have made that decision. Ultimately, though, there is a principle that I've held for the entirety of this war, and I want to hold, and that is the Ukrainian people ultimately make decisions about their own liberation. And so if the Ukrainian people are willing to take on this burden for their own suffering in order to achieve their own liberation so they can deal with the humanitarian crisis of the Russian occupation, you know, I tend to try to leave these decisions up to them. But I still stand principally against cluster munitions usage. Now, the cluster munitions are being sent. That's happening. What do we do now that the cluster munitions is going to be sent? First off, hope and pray that they're used in Zaporozhye and they're used not in urban environments, and the Ukrainian government is telling the truth when they say they're not going to use it in urban environments. That's the first thing. Because while we've been talking about bomblets, the other big risk with cluster munitions is they have a gigantic area of effect.
Germany still has to deal with World War II munitions all over our country. It is something you learn to live with. At least we are free now.
Thank you. I appreciate the $5. Also, if you look at other wars in history, if somebody was to tell you that could we liberate Germany or liberate France without cluster munitions uses, because a lot of cluster munitions. were used in a lot of the wars that America's fought in. I think basically ever since cluster munition have been invented, they've been used. That's how the Ukrainians are seeing this. They see this as a struggle for existential survival. So they're very willing, not very willing, but at least willing to skirt that line, even if we think they're going to have better judgment about where they use this. But we got to hope. Sorry, I'm kind of rambling. I have a lot of thoughts about this, a lot of emotions about this topic, definitely because I know it's the crews that I filmed with, that I got to know, that I lived with, that are going to have to deal with this after the fact. But first off, make sure and hold the Ukrainians to the commitment that they're only going to use this in the countryside, in the entrenched positions that the Russians have sent all up across the country, and not in urban environments. That's the first thing. Let's hope the Ukrainians are telling the truth on that, and let's hold them to that commitment. And if they don't, and if they aren't held to that commitment, then it should be made clear that cluster munition shipments will stop, right? If we're sending it, then those are some requirements that we should put in place. Now, here's the second thing. Now, the Ukrainian government is generally pretty good about this already, and I want to show you some examples of it, but there has to be very, very good awareness generally in Ukrainian society, now and for the future, about what these little bomblets will look like. Because the butterfly mines, those things, you see that one in the bottom right corner there? That killed a lot of children in Afghanistan who did not know what those bombs were. They thought they were toys because they looked plastic. And so a lot of Ukrainian society already has signs like this. Look out for mysterious devices. Don't touch mysterious devices. Don't touch these. Those are bombs. They'll kill you. You see, I saw them on trains. I saw them on billboards. I saw just normal ads for it. But that will have to include any type of munition that the United States sends over for them to be used, right? It will have to include that. And if anything, I think we should hype up that type of awareness. And if we're going to provide the munition, we should provide also everything that is necessary to use the munition effectively, or at least as safe as you can use a cluster munition. You can't use a cluster munition 100% safely. It's impossible. But I think we should maybe help them with this type of awareness, either by sending over instructors who can teach the soldiers who are going to be going into these trenches that have been hit with cluster munitions how to identify them, or even just the public, provide resources on that, as well as the fact, and this is my biggest point I want to hit home, because we should have been sending a larger supply of this period before this decision, but this decision has only made me feel more passionate about our need to send this stuff over, and only more aggressive on this. We need to send over more demining equipment, period, end of paragraph. We need to send over more protective equipment for deminers. We need to send over more metal detectors for deminers. We need to send over more drones for deminers so they can identify the mines. That's extremely helpful. That saves a lot of lives. And if we send them the correct type of drones, they might even be able to integrate an automatic gridding system, at least locally. A lot of demining from the upper echelons, the upper management, at least from my experience, they're not very good at integrating new and innovative ideas. But local deminers and local demining teams, they'll do it off the record and stuff like that. So they're going to need more drones and more equipment and stuff like that. Not only from individual volunteers, but also the federal government, because there's some stuff that's just so expensive that you can't really do like a YouTube stream, or just like a little bucket where people drop dollars in like a a grocery store, or like a checkout aisle. Some stuff is so expensive you just can't fundraise that way. An example would be demining vehicles. Demining vehicles are like $3.5 million if you're going to get like a good demining vehicle. $3.5 million if you're not retrofitting already existing tractors, which a lot of farmers have done to clear out their fields from unexploded munitions. We're going to have to send over more demining vehicles. We're going to have to send over more protective equipment. We're going to have to send over more metal detectors. We're going to have to send over more drones. If we're going to give somebody something that could hurt their civilian population, if the decision's already been made, then the least we can do is also send them the tools necessary to deal with that tool, to deal with that weapon as safely as possible once it's been used and duds have been inevitably deployed. Because if you're going to be firing these weapons, the duds are inevitably going to be there. I know a lot of the munitions were going to be sent over, that from the experts I've talked about, they said that they've probably been retrofitted to make it so it has a higher explosive rate, but there's still going to be duds. If you're using cluster munitions, there's going to be duds, no matter how much there's been improvements on this. even if the dud ratio is going to be much lower than the old Soviet equipment. So that's my advice. That's what I advise the American government should do if they're serious about the fact that it was a difficult decision. If it was a difficult decision to make, and I can see the mindset behind this, even though I still principally stand against sending cluster munitions or use of cluster munitions in war, I understand the logic there. But if you're going to do it, be more transparent about the testing requirements, send over more demining equipment, put requirements in place that even if the Ukrainian government has committed to not using these weapons in urban environments, make them doubly commit to it by saying, if you do, we'll just stop sending them, period. We will stop sending these types of weapons if you use them in a manner that is horrific and could kill civilians at an extremely high rate, like in urban environments, because of its high spread, the fact it covers entire football fields. Man, these are the stories that really kill you, man. Really kill you. No limits on arms to Ukraine. I want Russia to lose the war. Okay. Let me be clear. If the Biden administration starts sending over cluster munitions with the dud ratios that the Russians are using, that's going to kill a ton of civilians. We send over cluster munitions, it's already going to be a risk of, you know, dud ratios and stuff like that. But we're talking 20 to 30 to 40% dud ratios. That's horrific. And I don't believe we should be adding to that. So I don't think we should literally send every single weapon available. No, I don't think that's the case. We shouldn't be giving the fucking Ukrainians napalm, man. We should not be giving the Ukrainians napalm. I don't think that's a good idea. Send nukes and ICBMs. Brilliant analysis, as always, from chat. Brilliant analysis. Okay, guys, what do you think about my my commentary? I want your guys' thoughts on this, because I really thought about how to talk about this on stream. It's difficult, because think about the Ukrainian perspective on this. You're asking the Ukrainians to refrain from using a weapon that the Russians are using on a much greater scale to much greater effect with much higher dud ratios than the weapons that would be provided to them from the United States. And that would be perfect for clearing the area where they're having a ton of problems with right now in the Zaporozhye Oblast, while also they have no air superiority. We're asking the Ukrainians to conduct a miracle counteroffensive in the Zaporozhye Oblast, break through deeply entrenched Russian positions with no air superiority, while the Russians are using cluster munitions, but the Ukrainians aren't. It's not hard to understand the frustration of the Ukrainian position and why they're asking for cluster munitions. Treat the Russians like how we treated the Vietnamese. Somebody actually remove that message. That makes me uncomfortable. Actually, like, delete that. I'm glad you're saying this. It is wrong. Fuck. This is the problem, is that this is not a problem that I have an easy moral answer to. You know what I mean? Why weren't people so loud when cluster munitions were used in Syria? What do you mean? Okay, number one, the Syrian civil war started in 2013. I was like probably 12, right? But I actually did make noise. I think I'm one of the only people on Twitch that made noise about cluster munitions uses in Syria. I remember I bitched at Shuonhead about it because she posted a video of the Syrian Arab army using cluster munitions. I think it was literally like a barrel bomb. And she said, "Oh," and she like used it to present it as if it was like America doing it. I remember bitching at her about it, and I was bitching. But as I was saying, this isn't like a question I have an easy moral answer to, right? You get what I'm saying, right? The Ukrainian perspective is the Ukrainian perspective has solidly been, from my interactions, of, well, we won't have bomblets to worry about if we can't even go back to our villages. The humanitarian threat of these bomblets are smaller than the humanitarian threat of Russian occupation and mass graves. That's the response I've gotten from everyone I've talked to, including the deminers that are going to be the people who suffer probably the most. Because the thing is about civilians, a civilian may or may not end up touching one of those duds and they die, right? But this is going to be in the countryside, so it'll probably be much less than if it was in an urban environment. But the deminers have to. They inevitably have to, right? So I understand that perspective. But also, when we make rules, when it comes to the way we conduct war, we should stick to those rules. We should stick to them. Not to mention, it probably doesn't help that the Biden administration's U.S. ambassador to the UN called the Russian use of cluster munitions in Ukraine a war crime. It also didn't help that Jens Stoltenberg, the head of NATO, General Secretary of NATO, said the same thing. Jen Psaki, she also said the same thing during a press briefing. And now, afterwards, it feels like, the kind of, words are kind of shifting around a bit. I will give a little context for the UN statement. In the official government transcript of what the UN ambassador said at that meeting about cluster munitions, they struck that part out, and they then clarified afterwards that the use of cluster munitions on civilians. I was like, okay, well, okay. A lot of U.S. cluster munitions also have a self-destruct timer on bomblets themselves, where after a certain period of time, if it doesn't detonate, it will destroy itself. It's not perfect, but it does drastically reduce the instances of collateral damage. I mean, let me be clear about this. What we're going to be giving to the Ukrainians are going to have a much lower dud ratio by leaps and bounds to what the Russians are using when it comes to their cluster munitions. But when you've gotten into an argument of my cluster munitions are much safer than your cluster munitions, I'm already in really fucking uncomfortable territory here. Territory that best be avoided. Because I want the United States to sign on to the treaties regulating the use of cluster munitions and banning it. I want the United States to do that. That's another thing I think the Biden administration should commit to. If the Biden administration is admitting on television that, oh boy, this is a difficult decision. If they're saying that on TV, then they're admitting also to a certain extent that there is a distinction between a normal artillery shell and a cluster munition, and that they avoided sending the cluster munitions up to this point, and they did say that. Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor, he said this explicitly. He said, look, we avoided sending this as long as possible, but we've run out of other things to send as our production ramps up, and before we can send more traditional 155 millimeter shells for the 777 howitzers. If they're saying that, then they're kind of openly implying that these munitions are somewhat inhumane, are pretty dangerous. And if we can ramp up production of these types of weapons that are not cluster munitions, then why not use this opportunity to build up enough stockpile of normal artillery shells so we can disregard much, if not the entirety of, our cluster munition stockpiles. Now, cluster munitions are too effective to not use them. If the enemy uses them, we should too. This is why the Geneva Convention is important, and why I would want us to enter cluster munitions treaties with other countries. This is because if one side isn't following the Geneva Convention, it becomes much more difficult for the other side to also follow the Geneva Convention. Because even if the command says follow the Geneva Convention, even if the Russians do, that doesn't mean there won't still be individual instances of Ukrainian soldiers saying they're not following it. Why the fuck are we gonna follow it? They're already the big guy. They're fucking Russia. Nation 160 million people. We're 44 million people. We're at a massive disadvantage already, and we're gonna let them take the advantage. And that's another element to this. We got to remember, the Ukrainians are fighting the second most powerful military in the world, supposedly, not really, but what was supposed to be the second most powerful military in the world, with gigantic Soviet stockpiles. Even though they keep losing more T-72 tanks, more modern tanks, they're replacing them with old T-55s and T-54s. They're replacing them with other types of old Soviet munitions. They're a gigantic military force. They still have, they don't have air superiority, but they still have an air force that is operating within Ukrainian airspace. And so you're asking the Ukrainians to push through an extremely effective, powerful counteroffensive through the Russian entrenched lines with no air superiority, while the Russians are not the underdog, but the superior force. They're already in an underdog position, and then you're taking away tools that the Russians are leaving. That's why they don't want to. That's why they're not striking to use cluster munitions from the war. Use white phosphorus too? Jesus. Why, what would be the purpose of them using white phosphorus? Why would we even send them white phosphorus? If this is going to be done, it should only be done up to the rate which is absolutely necessary. It's just that Russia used it in Bakhmut, but Russia did not use white phosphorus in Bakhmut. They use other types of weapons that are similar to white phosphorus, but they don't use white phosphorus. I wish we kept it under 1%. I wish we kept it under 1% too. But the truth of the matter is that we are fighting one of the most intense artillery wars the world has ever seen. And 70% of the people who die from this war die from artillery. Whoever has the more artillery fire, the higher rate of fire, more precise artillery, whoever is performing better when it comes to the artillery battle has a gigantic advantage. And the Russians already have the advantage when it comes to the air. They don't have air superiority. The Ukrainians have denied them that. But they already have the advantage when it comes to the air. And they still have the advantage when it comes to the artillery. And so this is something that will try to balance out that advantage, as the Russians are already using it right now. Because that's the mindset from the Ukrainian government position. On the positive note, cluster munitions can also be used to demine the minefields that Russia put up in Zaporozhye. That is true. Cluster munitions can be used to quickly eliminate minefields, but that doesn't mean there's no explosives in the minefields. That means it would be easier for advancing armies to advance. That doesn't mean they're completely demined, because there's also going to be unexploded bomblets now in the minefield. And what if we tested each shell beforehand by blowing them up to make sure they aren't duds? That's a good idea. That's a good idea. Podunk795 in site chat, please type that. Please type up a full policy proposal, and we'll send it by Biden. Send it to Biden by the end of the day. By the end of the day. Are there any alternatives to cluster munitions that could still bust trenches? I mean, normal shells, drone dropped like mortars, indirect tank fire. But none of these things are going to be as effective as cluster munitions. Period. The reason why the Russians are using cluster munitions is because they fucking work. And that's the problem with cluster munitions, is they have duds, they have a gigantic spread of fire. So if you're using them in urban environments, it's holy shit, you could end up hitting civilians, but they work. They fucking work. Even HIMARS, HIMARS are, I mean, like, I think you could probably match up a HIMAR with cluster munitions, but it depends on what type of shell the HIMAR is using. There isn't just one type of HIMAR shell. The HIMAR is the rocket launcher system. It shoots different types of shells, which could include cluster munitions. But yeah, no, cluster munitions work. That's why countries like Russia don't want to ban their usage or sign these treaties. That's why the United States doesn't sign the treaties. Even if Biden is kind of like shuffling on the floor, like, golly gee, these cluster munitions kind of suck. Like, the reason we haven't banned it as a country is because they fucking work. And if the Russians aren't going to ban it, and if the Chinese are not going to ban it, and we're going to be in situations where they're on one side of a conflict and we're on the other and they're using it, we want to use it. That's how it is. Now, I think we should move towards a policy in the United States of not ever using cluster munitions, period, even if we have old stockpiles of them. But even having the stockpile could mean you could resort to something like this one day. But right now is a situation where you're like, shit, actually, yeah, maybe you would want to resort to cluster munitions usage if there's literally nothing else. That's why I would want the stockpiles of the traditional munitions to be so gigantic in the first place, or at least very large, or at least somewhat being able to pull on other countries. For example, the 500,000 artillery shells that the Koreans sent over. Also, did you know that we sent over a lot of cluster munitions to the Koreans as well? more you know. So that's another thing. Ukraine isn't the first country we've sent cluster munitions to, but it is what is unprecedented is us wavering the cluster munitions percentage regulation, 1%. Dylan, I guess it's the decision of the Ukrainians if they're okay using them. But if they're going to use them, I hope it's done responsibly. And we maintain solid commitments and the UN doesn't start ramping up cluster ammo production and Ukraine keeps it in the countryside. I don't think we should be producing cluster munitions, period. Period. That's why it's going to rely on old stockpiles. But we have like 4.7, I think, 4.7 million cluster munitions, making up, I think, a ratio of like 500 million bomblets. So we have a stockpile. The world would be better without them, yes, and that's why we should move to not have them. Is there a chance the US might use them to justify increasing cluster ammo production? I don't think so. I don't think that's likely. They're already having enough trouble trying to increase the production of the shells they're making right now. So I doubt they would also try to strain that and add like cluster munitions as well. Plus that's not the timeline the Biden administration has stated. They've stated a different timeline to get off of the cluster munition. I don't think that's likely. Why do we impose restrictions on Ukraine while letting Russia do anything they want? Well, we can't have a policy of if the Russians did it, we should do it. The Russians didn't have a strategic advantage and we should do it. If the Russians have let me ask you a question. If somebody could argue there was a strategic advantage to leveling an apartment block full of civilians, that doesn't mean we should do it. Anyway, I think I've said all I want to say. I'm sorry I'm not giving you guys a strong moral position, like this is the opinion you need to have. And the reason why is this is a difficult moral question. This isn't a moral question I have an easy answer to. And Biden was right when he said it was a difficult decision. And I still stand against cluster munitions use, stand against it principally, but if they're going to do it, I hope they go with the ideas that I proposed earlier in this video.